900,000 years ago, humanity almost ended. Not in some distant future apocalypse movie, not in a science fiction novel, in our actual past, the real history of our species, and here's what makes it absolutely terrifying. 99% of all human ancestors vanished. Gone. Wiped out. Only 280 breeding individuals survived on the entire planet. Let that sink in for a second. 280 people. That's smaller than most high schools, smaller than a typical college campus, fewer people than can fit in a movie theatre, and those 280 individuals were all that stood between humanity existing and humanity becoming just another extinct species that nobody would ever know about. If you're using this video to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and definitely leave a comment telling me where you are right now and what time it is. Seriously, I read every single one and it's wild. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching together. It's like a global sleepover where we're all trying to learn something fascinating while drifting off. Now, back to our near extinction. This isn't ancient mythology. This isn't speculation. This is cutting-edge genetic science that was only discovered in 2023. For the first time in human history, we can prove that our entire species was reduced to a population so small that we should not exist today. Think about the odds. When animal populations drop below a few thousand individuals, they almost never recover. There's this concept in biology called the extinction vortex. Once you're in it, you just spiral down until there's nothing left. Genetic problems multiply. Inbreeding weakens each generation. A single drought, a single disease, a single bad winter can wipe out everyone who's left. Passenger pigeons. There were billions of them in North America, billions. Then humans started hunting them aggressively, and the population crashed. Once they dropped below a certain threshold, they couldn't recover. The last passenger pigeon died in 1914, gone forever. Cheetahs went through something similar about 12,000 years ago. Their population crashed so severely that every cheetah alive today is so genetically similar they can accept skin grafts from each other without rejection. They're basically all identical twins, and cheetahs are still struggling. They're still endangered. They never really bounce back. But somehow, against every mathematical model, against every biological prediction, our ancestors not only survived, they thrived. Today there are over 8 billion humans on Earth. We've conquered every continent except Antarctica. We've sent robots to Mars. We've split the atom and mapped the human genome. We are the most successful large mammal on the planet, and it almost didn't happen. So what could possibly reduce humanity to just 1,280 individuals? What kind of catastrophe could wipe out 99% of an entire species spread across Africa, possibly parts of Europe and Asia? What was so devastating that it nearly erased humanity before we'd really even begun? Was it a supervolcano that filled the sky with ash and plunged the world into darkness? Was it a climate catastrophe that turned fertile land into barren desert? Was it disease, sweeping through populations faster than anyone could escape? Or was it something else entirely, something we haven't even imagined yet? Tonight, we're going to explore one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution, a mystery that nobody knew existed until a scientist in China started seeing impossible patterns in genetic data. Patterns that suggested our entire understanding of human history was missing a chapter. The most important chapter. The one where we almost didn't make it. We'll follow the genetic detective story of how researchers pieced together evidence from the DNA of thousands of people around the world, tracking mutations backward through time like following breadcrumbs through a dark forest. We'll discover what the world looked like 900,000 years ago, when our ancestors were thriving, spreading across continents, developing new technologies, living lives we can barely imagine. Then we'll witness the collapse, the catastrophic event or series of events that killed off population after population until only a tiny group remained. We'll explore the leading theories, what scientists think happened during those dark years when the fossil record goes almost completely silent and human remains simply disappear from the archaeological record. But the most incredible part of the story isn't the collapse, it's what came after. 117,000 years. That's how long humanity stayed at those critically low numbers. Not 117 years, not 170 years, 117,000 years of hanging on by our fingernails while most other species around us went extinct. How did they survive? Where did they live? What technologies or social structures allowed a population that small to persist for 100 millennia? And what happened to change our fortunes? How did we finally claw our way back from the edge of extinction to become the dominant species on Earth? We'll also explore the unexpected legacy of our brush with extinction, how those 117,000 years of survival fundamentally changed human genetics, how our chromosomes literally fused together during this period, something that happens maybe once in millions of years, how our brains evolved in ways that might never have happened if we'd remained a large, stable population, and we'll discover why this matters today. Why understanding this forgotten apocalypse helps explain everything from why humans are more susceptible to certain diseases than other primates, to why we're so genetically similar despite being spread across the entire globe. 6 mysteries, 1 ancient catastrophe, and the most incredible survival story ever told. Because every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're all descendants of those 1,280 survivors who refused to give up when giving up was the only logical option. So get comfortable, relax. Let your mind drift back 900,000 years to the day humanity almost ended, and the moment a few tough ancestors decided our story wasn't over yet. The genetic detective story, how scientists discovered our forgotten apocalypse. The discovery didn't come from fossils or ancient ruins, it came from you, from your DNA and the DNA of thousands of people living ordinary lives, completely unaware they were carrying evidence of humanity's closest brush with extinction. In 2023, a team of researchers led by scientists at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai published a study that would rewrite human history. They had analysed the genetic sequences of 354 modern humans from populations all across the globe: African, European, Asian, Indigenous American, Pacific Islander. Every major human population represented. They were using cutting-edge computational genomics to reconstruct our evolutionary past, and what they found in the data shouldn't have been possible. The numbers suggested that around 900,000 years ago, the human population had collapsed to fewer than 1,300 breeding individuals, and that this bottleneck had lasted not for a few generations, not for a few thousand years, but for 117,000 years. More than twice as long as our species Homo sapiens has even existed. The researchers thought they had made a mistake. They ran the analysis again. Same result. They checked their computational models for errors. The models were fine. They expanded their dataset, adding more genetic sequences from more diverse populations. The bottleneck signal got stronger, not weaker. They were looking at the genetic equivalent of a crime scene, and the evidence was pointing to something catastrophic, something that had nearly ended the human story before it really began. But how does DNA from living people tell us what happened 900,000 years ago? How can scientists read extinction events in the blood of people walking around today? The answer lies in understanding that your genome is a history book. Every gene, every chromosome, every seemingly random mutation is a record of your ancestors' survival. And when you know how to read that record, It tells stories that no fossil or ancient artifact ever could. Here's how genetic archaeology works. Every time a cell divides and copies its DNA, there's a tiny chance of error. A single letter in the genetic code gets changed, a mutation occurs. Most of these mutations are completely neutral. They don't help you, they don't hurt you, they just exist. And because they're neutral, they accumulate at a relatively steady rate over time. This gives us what scientists call the molecular clock. If you compare your DNA to someone else's, you can count the number of differences between you and estimate how long ago you shared a common ancestor. The more differences, the longer ago you diverged. The fewer differences, the more recently you're related. Scale this up to thousands of people from populations all over the world, and you can reconstruct the entire family tree of humanity, branching backward through time. But there's something even more revealing than the number of mutations. It's the pattern of genetic diversity itself. Large stable populations maintain high genetic diversity. Lots of different gene variants floating around in the population, lots of unique mutations that haven't spread to everyone yet. Every individual is genetically distinct from every other individual in subtle but measurable ways. Small populations are different. When a population shrinks dramatically, genetic diversity collapses too. Imagine you have a jar containing 10,000 marbles in 1,000 different colours. Now randomly pull out just 13 marbles. Those 13 marbles won't represent all 1,000 colours. You might get 6 blues, 4 reds, 2 greens, and a yellow. All the other 996 colours are gone. That's what happens to genetic diversity during a population bottleneck. And here's what makes it permanent. When that small population expands again, every new individual is descended from those original 13 marbles. You might eventually have millions of marbles again, but they'll all be variations of blue, red, green, or yellow. The other 996 colours are extinct, forever. The genetic signature of that bottleneck persists through all future generations. That's what the 2023 study found in human DNA. When they analysed genetic diversity across the entire human population, they found something shocking. We have far less genetic diversity than we should. Compared to other great apes, compared to most mammal species, compared to what population models predict for a species that's been around as long as humans have, we're genetically impoverished. 2 random humans, picked from opposite sides of the planet, are more genetically similar to each other than 2 chimpanzees from the same forest in Africa. Think about that. Chimpanzees who live in one continent have more genetic diversity than humans who live everywhere from the Arctic to the tropics. That's not normal. That's the signature of a bottleneck. But it gets more specific. When the researchers used advanced computational techniques to look at when genetic lineages coalesced, when they traced back to common ancestors, they found a massive pile-up around 900,000 years ago. It's like they were watching rivers of ancestry flowing backward through time, and suddenly, around that date, all the rivers converged into a single narrow channel. The technical term is coalescence analysis. You take genetic sequences from modern humans and use mutation rates to calculate when different lineages split from each other. In a population that's been large and stable for a long time, coalescence dates spread out evenly. Different lineages diverged at different times, creating a smooth distribution across hundreds of thousands of years. But that's not what they saw. Instead, they found what geneticists call a coalescent bottleneck. A period where nearly all genetic lineages across all human populations traced back to an extremely small ancestral population. The statistical models pointed to a breeding population of just 1,280 individuals. That's not total population. That's breeding individuals, adults of reproductive age. Including children and elderly, the total population might have reached 2,000 people. Maybe slightly more, but that was it. That was all of humanity. and the duration of this bottleneck was equally shocking. This wasn't a brief crisis. It wasn't a single devastating event that killed most humans and then the population bounced back. The genetic evidence showed that human numbers stayed incredibly low for 117,000 years, over 1,000 human generations spent on the brink of extinction. To put that in perspective, modern humans, Homo sapiens, have only existed as a distinct species for about 300,000 years. Our bottleneck ancestors lived in crisis mode for more than a third of that entire time span. Behavioural modernity, the traits that make us uniquely human, art, complex language, abstract reasoning, all evolved within the last 100,000 years. Our ancestors spent longer in bottleneck conditions than we've spent as modern humans. When the study was first published, the scientific community reacted with scepticism. Not because the methods were flawed, they were actually quite sophisticated, but because the implications were so enormous. A bottleneck this severe and this prolonged should have driven human evolution into a dead end. Most species don't recover from population crashes this extreme. Other scientists began checking the findings using different methods. Some analysed ancient DNA from fossil remains. Others used different computational models to estimate historical population sizes. A few looked at specific genetic markers known to be sensitive to population bottlenecks. The result was the same across different approaches. Around 900,000 years ago, something had nearly wiped out the human species, and we had somehow survived. But the genetic evidence revealed something else, something that made the bottleneck even more remarkable. It wasn't just that the population crashed, it's that during those 117,000 years, something unprecedented happened to human evolution. The genetic signatures showed intense natural selection operating across multiple genes simultaneously. Genes involved in brain development, genes regulating stress response, genes affecting social behaviour, all showing evidence of strong selection pressure during the bottleneck period. This is unusual. Most of the time, evolution is gradual, small changes accumulating generation by generation. But during extreme bottlenecks, evolution can accelerate dramatically. With such a small population, any beneficial mutation can spread through the entire species in just a few thousand years. And with survival, pressures so extreme, only the most adaptive traits persist. The researchers found evidence of this accelerated evolution in something called selective sweeps. These occur when a beneficial mutation appears and spreads so quickly through a population that it drags neighbouring genetic sequences along with it, creating a detectable signature in modern DNA. The bottleneck period showed multiple selective sweeps across genes related to cognitive function, immune response, and metabolic efficiency. Even more revealing were the genetic variants that disappeared during the bottleneck. By comparing human DNA to Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, both of which split from our lineage around this time, researchers could identify gene variants that existed before the bottleneck but vanished after it. These lost variants told a story of extreme selection. Any genetic trait that didn't contribute directly to survival during the crisis was eliminated from the human gene pool. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from studying what geneticists call linkage disequilibrium. This is a measure of how often certain genetic variants are inherited together. In large populations, linkage breaks down quickly. Sexual reproduction shuffles genes each generation, so variants that are close together on the same chromosome gradually become separated. But in small populations, this shuffling is less effective. Genetic variants that were linked during the bottleneck period tend to stay linked even in modern populations. When researchers analysed linkage patterns across the human genome, they found extensive regions where variants were still linked in ways that only made sense if the population had been tiny 900,000 years ago. It was like finding fingerprints at a crime scene. The passage of time hadn't erased the evidence. Every human alive today still carries the genetic signature of those desperate millennia. The study also solved another long-standing mystery in human evolution. For decades, anthropologists had known that something strange happened to human chromosomes. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, but chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all have 24 pairs. Somewhere in our evolutionary history, 2 chromosomes fused together into one. Scientists could see the fusion point clearly in human chromosome 2. The genetic sequences that should be at the ends of 2 separate chromosomes are right there in the middle of a single chromosome, like a scar marking where they joined. But when did this fusion happen, and why didn't it kill the lineage? Chromosomal fusions are usually devastating. They cause reproductive problems, developmental abnormalities, and reduced fitness. An individual born with a chromosomal fusion would typically have difficulty reproducing, and the fusion would disappear from the population within a generation or 2, unless the population was incredibly small. In a bottleneck of just 1,280 individuals, a chromosomal fusion could spread through the entire species in a relatively short time, especially if, by chance, individuals carrying the fusion happened to be slightly better suited to bottleneck conditions, or if random chance, what geneticists call genetic drift, caused the fusion to become common simply because the population was so small that every breeding individual's genes mattered enormously. The timing matched perfectly. The chromosomal fusion appears to have occurred right around 900,000 years ago, right at the beginning of the bottleneck. This wasn't coincidence. The bottleneck created exactly the conditions under which a normally disadvantageous mutation could become fixed in the entire human population. We all carry fused chromosomes today because our ancestors went through that narrow genetic channel when numbers were so low that random chance could reshape the entire species. The researchers also compared the human bottleneck to similar events in other species. Cheetahs went through a severe bottleneck about 10,000 years ago, reducing them to perhaps 7,000 individuals. Today, cheetahs are so genetically uniform that skin grafts between unrelated individuals aren't rejected. They're essentially genetic clones. But they weren't bottlenecked nearly as severely or for as long as humans were. Northern elephant seals crashed to fewer than 100 individuals in the 1890s due to hunting. They've since recovered to over 200,000 animals, but their genetic diversity is so low that they're vulnerable to disease and environmental changes. The population has bounced back, but the genetic impoverishment persists, and their bottleneck lasted only a few generations, not 117,000 years. Mountain gorillas, with a current population of just over 1,000 individuals, are considered critically endangered. Their genetic diversity is declining, and conservationists worry they may not survive long term. Yet their numbers are comparable to what humans experienced during the bottleneck. Imagine maintaining those crisis-level population numbers not for a few decades, but for over 100,000 years. That's what our ancestors endured. The human bottleneck was uniquely severe. No other great ape species, no other primate, no other large mammal has ever been documented with such a severe and prolonged population crash, followed by successful recovery. We came closer to extinction than cheetahs, than elephant seals, than any endangered species alive today, and we stayed at the brink far longer than any of them, but we're still here. Not only did those 1,280 individuals survive, their descendants went on to become the most successful large animal in Earth's history. Today, humans number over 8 billion. We've spread to every continent and every ecosystem. We've fundamentally altered the planet's climate, geography and biology. All of that traces back to a population smaller than a modern village, struggling to survive somewhere in Africa 900,000 years ago. The genetic detective story doesn't just tell us we survived. It tells us the survival changed us. Those 117,000 years of intense selection pressure refined human evolution in ways that still affect us today. The cognitive abilities that allowed our ancestors to survive in impossibly harsh conditions became the foundation for everything that makes us human. Complex language, abstract reasoning, technological innovation, sophisticated social cooperation. All of these traits were selected for during the Bottleneck period. Every human alive today is a descendant of those survivors. Every person you've ever met, every face you've ever seen, traces their ancestry to that tiny population clinging to existence in Africa. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. We're all bottleneck survivors. Our genes carry the scars and the adaptations of the ancient crisis. And the researchers who discovered this, they're still analysing the data, still uncovering new implications. Because once you know there was a bottleneck, you can look for specific signatures of selection during that period. You can identify which genes were under the most pressure. You can reconstruct what kind of environmental challenges our ancestors faced. You can even estimate where geographically the bottleneck population survived. The genetic detective story is still being written. New techniques, better computational models, and larger data sets are revealing more details every year. But the basic facts are now established beyond reasonable doubt. Around 900,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened. The human population collapsed to fewer than 1 to 300 breeding individuals, and we stayed at that critically low level for 117,000 years. Long enough that the bottleneck fundamentally reshaped human evolution. Long enough that every human today carries its signature in their DNA. But what caused it? What could possibly drive humanity to the edge of extinction and keep us there for over 100,000 years? That's where the genetic evidence ends and the theories begin. Because DNA can tell us what happened and when it happened, but it can't tell us why. The world before the collapse, our thriving ancestors. Let's go back. Way back. 900,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. Before the collapse, before 99% of humanity vanished, before everything changed forever. Picture the world as it was then. Not the world you know. No cities, no farms, no roads or borders or nations. But not empty either. Far from it. Africa, the cradle of humanity, was thriving with human life in a way it wouldn't again for hundreds of thousands of years. The best genetic estimates suggest there were between 98,000 and 100,000 breeding individuals. That's adults capable of having children. Add in kids, teenagers and elderly members of the group, and you're looking at a total population somewhere around 150,000 to 200,000 human beings. Doesn't sound like much by modern standards. Today, that's a small city. Back then, it represented the most successful our lineage had ever been. These weren't modern humans, not yet. They were our ancestors, populations that anthropologists classify as either late Homo erectus or early Homo heidelbergensis, depending on which fossils you're looking at and which expert you ask. The taxonomy gets fuzzy this far back, but the important thing is they were us, our direct ancestors. Every person alive today descends from them. And they had been winning at the game of survival for a very long time. Homo erectus had been around for nearly 1.5 million years by this point. Think about that. 1.5 million years of continuous survival. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have only existed for about 300,000 years. We've got a long way to go before we match our ancestors' track record. These early humans had spread across the entire African continent, from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south, from the Atlantic shores in the west to the highlands of Ethiopia in the east. Everywhere you could walk in Africa there were humans, but they weren't evenly distributed. Like all intelligent species, they concentrated in the good spots. river valleys where water was reliable, coastal areas where seafood supplemented the diet, savanna edges where grasslands met woodlands, creating rich ecotones with diverse plant and animal life, forest margins where you could hunt in the open but retreat to cover when necessary. The landscape they inhabited was both familiar and alien compared to modern Africa. Familiar because the basic geography was the same. The Great Rift Valley cutting through East Africa, the vast Sahara to the north, the Congo Basin rainforest in the centre, the sprawling savannas of the east and south, but alien because the climate was different. 900,000 years ago, Earth was in the midst of a long period of climate instability. Ice ages came and went. Global temperatures fluctuated wildly over relatively short periods. What was lush grassland in one generation could become desert in the next. Rivers that had flowed for thousands of years could dry up within a human lifetime. Our ancestors had learned to handle this instability. They were adaptable. That was their superpower. When the rains failed in one region, they moved to another. When large game became scarce, they shifted to smaller prey or increased their gathering of plant foods. When the savannas expanded, they followed the grasslands. When forests grew, they adapted to woodland life. This adaptability showed up in their tools. 900,000 years ago, human stone tool technology had already been evolving for over 2 million years. Our ancestors weren't banging rocks together randomly. They were skilled craftspeople who understood the properties of different stone types and could produce sophisticated implements for specific purposes. Their signature technology was the Acheulean hand axe. If you've ever seen pictures of teardrop-shaped stone tools symmetrical on both sides, carefully flaked to create sharp edges all around, that's an Acheulean hand axe. They're beautiful objects. Some archaeologists think they might have been the first human art, tools made more carefully than strictly necessary, possibly as displays of skill or status, but they were also incredibly functional. A well-made hand axe could butcher an elephant. It could chop wood. It could dig for roots. It could be used as a weapon in a pinch. It was the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age, a multi-purpose tool that had proven its worth over hundreds of thousands of years of use. And they were making other tools too. Scrapers for cleaning hides, choppers for breaking bones to extract marrow, simple spears, probably wooden shafts with fire-hardened points. Some evidence suggests they might have been hafting stone points to wooden handles with plant resins or animal sinews, creating composite tools that combine different materials for enhanced effectiveness. The fire-hardened spears are particularly important. They tell us something crucial. These people controlled fire, not just opportunistically using fire from lightning strikes, but creating it, maintaining it, and using it purposefully. Fire hardening a wooden spear point requires careful control of heat and timing. You can't do it by accident. You need to understand what fire does to wood and how to manipulate that process for your benefit. And they were using fire for much more than tool-making. Archaeological sites from this period show clear evidence of hearths, deliberately constructed fire pits where our ancestors cooked food, stayed warm, and gathered socially. Some sites show evidence of controlled burning of vegetation, suggesting they might have been using fire to manage landscapes, clearing underbrush to make hunting easier or encourage the growth of preferred plant species. Fire also extended their day. Before fire, humans were diurnal creatures like most primates, active during daylight, vulnerable at night. Fire changed everything. It pushed back the darkness. It kept predators away. It created a safe space where people could gather after sunset, maintaining social bonds and sharing information. And this is where things get really interesting, because those evening gatherings around the fire were probably where human culture really developed. Not the material culture of tools and technology, but the social culture of stories, relationships, and shared knowledge. We know these early humans had complex social structures. The archaeological evidence is clear. They were living in groups of probably 25 to 50 individuals, extended family units that anthropologists call bands. These weren't random collections of people. They were organised societies with relationships, hierarchies and rules. We can infer this from several lines of evidence. First, the presence of elderly individuals and disabled people in the fossil record. There are Homo erectus skeletons showing severe injuries or diseases that would have been debilitating, broken legs that healed, missing teeth that would have made eating difficult, arthritis that would have limited mobility. These people survive for years after their injuries, which means someone was taking care of them. You don't care for the weak and elderly unless you have social bonds, family relationships, and a sense of obligation to group members. Second, the distribution of stone tools and raw materials. Archaeological sites show that high-quality stone suitable for toolmaking was being moved long distances. A site in East Africa might contain tools made from obsidian that came from 50 miles away. That stone didn't walk there by itself. Someone carried it, either through direct travel or through exchange between groups. An exchange implies social relationships beyond the immediate family group. Trade networks, alliances, connections between bands that allowed the movement of goods and probably people. Third, the sophistication of their hunting strategies. Taking down large prey, the elephants and hippos and giant buffalo that roamed Africa 900,000 years ago, requires coordination. You can't do it alone. You need a group working together, communicating clearly, following a plan. Some individuals driving the animal toward an ambush point, others waiting to attack, everyone understanding their role and executing it at the right time. That's organised group behaviour. That's culture. And they were almost certainly communicating verbally. Now, we can't know exactly what their language capabilities were. Language doesn't fossilise, but everything about their behaviour suggests they could communicate complex information efficiently. Teaching someone to make an Acheulean hand axe requires explaining multiple steps in sequence. Coordinating a group hunt requires real-time communication. Maintaining trade relationships with distant groups requires the ability to negotiate and make agreements. Some researchers think they might have had proto-language, simpler than modern speech but more sophisticated than the calls and gestures of other primates. Others think they had full language capabilities essentially identical to our own. The debate continues, but nobody seriously argues they were communicating only through grunts and gestures. They were too successful for that. Their behaviour was too complex. There's even tentative evidence for symbolic thinking. A few archaeological sites have produced objects that seem to serve no practical purpose. Stones with interesting natural patterns that were picked up and carried. Shells with holes drilled through them, possibly for use as beads or pendants. Patches of red ochre, an iron-rich mineral that creates a vivid red pigment when ground and mixed with water or fat. Red ochre is particularly intriguing because it shows up at human sites for hundreds of thousands of years. Why were they collecting it? The most common theory is body decoration, paint for skin or hair, maybe for practical purposes like sun protection or insect repellent, but maybe for symbolic purposes, marking individuals by status or achievement, decorating bodies for ceremonies or rituals. We can't know for sure. But the fact that they were doing something non-essential with this material suggests they were thinking beyond immediate survival needs. They might have been creating art too, not the sophisticated cave paintings that would appear much later, but simpler marks and patterns. Some researchers claim to have found deliberately created geometric patterns scratched into rocks or bones from this time period. Others dispute these claims, arguing the marks are natural or accidental. Again, the evidence is frustratingly indirect, but it's suggestive. What we can say with certainty is that these people had rich internal lives. They weren't just surviving moment to moment, they were thinking, planning, imagining. They had relationships and emotions. They cared for their children and mourned their dead. They probably had concepts of fairness and justice, at least within their own groups. They might have had beliefs about the world that went beyond the immediately observable, proto-religious ideas about spirits or forces that influenced their lives, and they were successful. That population of 98,000 to 100,000 breeding individuals represents the high point of early human evolution up to that moment. They had achieved a kind of equilibrium with their environment, not static. They were still evolving, still adapting, but stable, sustainable. They could support their population size year after year, generation after generation, without depleting resources or facing systematic collapse. Different regions of Africa had developed their own local populations with slightly different adaptations. The people living in the forests of Central Africa probably looked and behaved somewhat differently from those on the savannas of East Africa or the grasslands of the South. Not different enough to be separate species. They could all interbreed freely, share technology and communicate, but different enough that you could probably tell where someone came from by looking at them or listening to them speak. This regional diversity was actually a strength. It meant the human species as a whole wasn't dependent on any single environment or food source. If disaster struck one region, other populations could survive and eventually repopulate the affected areas. It was a kind of evolutionary insurance policy, spreading risk across multiple populations and environments. The climate they inhabited was actually fairly favourable during this period, at least by the standards of Ice Age Earth. This was during an interglacial period, one of those brief respites between ice ages when global temperatures warmed and ice sheets retreated. Africa wasn't directly glaciated even during ice ages, it's too close to the equator. But ice ages affected Africa profoundly through changes in rainfall patterns. During ice ages, Africa tended to be drier, the Sahara expanded, tropical forests shrank, lakes and rivers diminished. During interglacial periods like the one 900,000 years ago, the rains returned. Grasslands expanded, forests grew, rivers ran full, animal populations thrived, which meant human populations could thrive too. Our ancestors were taking full advantage of this favourable period. They had spread to every viable habitat. They were exploiting a wide range of food sources. They had developed technologies that made them effective hunters and efficient foragers. Their population was at or near the carrying capacity of the African environment using Stone Age technology. From an evolutionary perspective, they had made it. They were successful. They had survived for over 1 million years as a species and were positioned to continue indefinitely. There was no reason to think anything was about to change. But here's the thing about evolution and ecology. Success creates vulnerability. When a species becomes too well adapted to specific conditions, too dependent on particular resources, too numerous relative to their environment, they become fragile. Like a house of cards built too high, impressive in its complexity but vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. These early humans had achieved remarkable success through adaptability, but they were still fundamentally dependent on the African environment, on the plants and animals they hunted and gathered, on the reliable water sources where they camped, on the climate patterns that sustained the ecosystems they exploited, on the relatively stable conditions that had allowed them to expand their population to 100,000 breeding individuals. They had survived climate fluctuations before, dozens of them over hundreds of thousands of years, droughts that lasted decades, cold snaps that altered vegetation patterns, regional disasters that disrupted local populations. But they had always recovered. Population numbers might drop temporarily in affected regions, but other areas remained stable, and within a few generations the affected populations would bounce back. They had no way of knowing that something different was coming, something unprecedented in scale and duration, something that would push not just regional populations but the entire species to the absolute brink of extinction. They were living their lives, raising their children, making their tools, following the same seasonal patterns their ancestors had followed for hundreds of thousands of years. And then the world began to end, not suddenly, not with a single catastrophic event that wiped out populations overnight, but slowly, inexorably, over years and decades and eventually centuries. The climate began to shift in ways it never had before. The rains failed and kept failing. Water sources dried up. Plant communities changed. Animal migrations altered their patterns or stopped entirely. And the human population, which had seemed so successful, so stable, so secure, began to shrink. They didn't know they were entering a bottleneck that would last 117,000 years. They didn't know that 99% of their species was about to disappear. They didn't know that only 280 individuals would survive to pass on their genes to future generations. They were just trying to survive another day, another season, another year, doing what their ancestors had always done, but finding it harder and harder to succeed. The age of prosperity was ending. The age of survival was about to begin. The Catastrophe Theories. What could kill 99% of humanity? So we know something catastrophic happened 900,000 years ago. Something so devastating that it reduced the entire human population to fewer breeding adults than you'd find in a small modern town. But what was it? What kind of event could bring our species that close to total extinction? This is where things get really interesting and really frustrating. Because despite decades of research, hundreds of scientific papers, and genetic evidence that proves the bottleneck happened, we still don't know for certain what caused it. We have theories, lots of them, each one terrifying in its own way, each one capable of explaining part of the puzzle, but none that perfectly fits all the evidence. Let's walk through the leading candidates. Each scenario that could have wiped out 99% of humanity and almost ended our story before it really began. Theory number 1 is the supervolcano. This is the most dramatic hypothesis, the one that shows up in disaster documentaries and keeps geologists awake at night. The idea is that around 900,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption, something on the scale of a VI8 catastrophe, hurled so much material into the atmosphere that it triggered what scientists call a volcanic winter. Here's how it would work. A supervolcano doesn't just erupt, it explodes with the force of hundreds of nuclear weapons. The eruption itself would kill everything within hundreds of miles instantly. But the real damage happens next. Billions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide get blasted into the stratosphere, where they spread across the entire planet. This aerosol cloud blocks sunlight, and not just for weeks or months. After a true supervolcanic eruption, the skies can remain darkened for years, maybe decades. Without sunlight, temperatures plummet. Plants die. The ones that depend on photosynthesis simply can't survive. Within a single growing season, most vegetation across Africa would wither. The herbivores that depend on those plants would starve. The predators that hunt those herbivores would follow. The entire food chain collapses from the bottom up. For early humans, who were primarily scavengers and opportunistic hunters, this would be an absolute nightmare. No large animals to hunt or scavenge means no reliable protein source. No plants means no backup food during lean times. You're looking at continent-wide famine that could last a generation or more. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but intriguing. We know supervolcanoes have erupted in human prehistory. Toba in Indonesia exploded about 74,000 years ago, and genetic evidence suggests it caused another smaller bottleneck in human populations. If it happened once, it could have happened before. We also know there are geological formations in East Africa that show evidence of massive volcanic activity throughout the Pleistocene. The East African Rift Valley, where many of our ancestors lived, is one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. It's entirely plausible that a supervolcano erupted there or nearby around 900,000 years ago. But here's the problem. We haven't found the smoking gun, or more precisely, we haven't found the ash layer. When a supervolcano erupts, it leaves a distinctive geological signature, a layer of volcanic ash that can be found in ice cores, lake sediments, and soil samples across wide areas. Scientists have looked for this signature dating to 900,000 years ago, and it's not there. At least not at the scale you'd expect from an eruption capable of causing a bottleneck this severe. Some researchers argue that we might have just missed it. Geological records from that far back are incomplete, especially in tropical regions where weathering and erosion can erase evidence quickly. Others think maybe the supervolcano was located somewhere unexpected, perhaps Antarctica or under the ocean, where the ash signature would be harder to detect. But without definitive geological proof, the supervolcano theory remains just that, a theory. Theory number 2 is extreme glaciation. This is the Ice Age hypothesis, and it's based on what we know about Earth climate during the Pleistocene. Our planet has been cycling through ice ages and warmer interglacial periods for the last 2.6 million years. These aren't minor temperature fluctuations. During the coldest phases of glaciation, ice sheets thousands of feet thick covered most of North America, Europe, and northern Asia. Sea levels dropped by 400 feet. Tropical rainforests shrank to tiny refuges. The world became colder, drier, and far less hospitable to life. Now here's what makes this theory compelling. Around 900,000 years ago, something fundamental changed in Earth's climate patterns. Scientists call it the mid-Pleistocene transition. Before this point, ice ages came and went in cycles lasting about 41,000 years. After the transition, the cycles stretched to roughly 100,000 years, and they became much more extreme. Colder cold periods and warmer warm periods, with rapid swings between them. The transition itself was chaotic. Climate didn't shift smoothly from one pattern to another. Instead, there were centuries of violent oscillations. Temperatures would plunge, stay brutally cold for a few thousand years, then suddenly spike, then crash again. These rapid changes would have been devastating to any species trying to survive. Food sources that your grandparents relied on would disappear. Water sources would dry up or freeze over. The seasonal patterns that guided hunting and gathering would become completely unpredictable. For early humans in Africa, this would have meant watching their environment transform repeatedly over relatively short timescales. Grasslands turning to desert, then back to grassland, then to scrubland. Lakes appearing and vanishing. Animal migration shifting or stopping entirely. If you've developed survival strategies based on predictable patterns, and those patterns suddenly become chaotic, you're in serious trouble. The evidence for this theory is stronger than the supervolcano hypothesis. We have ice core data showing the mid-Pleistocene transition happened right when the bottleneck occurred. We have fossil records showing that many large mammal species went extinct or experienced severe population crashes during this period. We know from ocean sediments that African climate became particularly unstable around 900,000 years ago, with extreme droughts alternating with heavy rainfall. But there's a problem with this theory too. Glaciation events, even extreme ones, don't typically cause extinction bottlenecks this severe. Other species that lived through the same climate changes didn't experience population crashes of this magnitude. If climate change alone could reduce human populations by 99%, why didn't it do the same to other African mammals? Why were we so uniquely vulnerable? Some researchers think the answer lies in human specialization. By 900,000 years ago, our ancestors might have become dependent on specific resources or habitats, that were particularly affected by the climate swings. Maybe they relied heavily on lakeside environments, and the repeated drying and refilling of lakes disrupted their survival strategies. Maybe they depended on certain prey animals that went locally extinct. But this is speculation. We don't have enough archaeological evidence from that period to say for certain. Theory number 3 is the cosmic event hypothesis. This is the most sci-fi sounding of the theories, but it's taken seriously by a growing number of scientists. The idea is that Earth was hit by intense radiation from space, either from a solar superstorm, a nearby supernova, or possibly even a gamma ray burst from a collapsing star thousands of light years away. Let's start with solar superstorms. The sun isn't constant. It goes through cycles of activity, and occasionally it produces massive coronal mass ejections that send billions of tons of charged particles into space. Most of the time, Earth's magnetic field protects us. The particles get deflected, creating beautiful auroras but little damage. But if a truly massive solar storm hit at the right angle, or if Earth's magnetic field was weakened for some reason, those particles could reach the surface. The effects would be invisible but deadly. High-energy radiation would increase cancer rates and cause genetic damage. But more immediately, it would wreak havoc on the atmosphere. Solar particles interact with nitrogen and oxygen to create nitrogen oxides, which destroy the ozone layer. Without ozone protection, ultraviolet radiation from the sun would reach Earth's surface at levels high enough to cause severe sunburns within minutes. Plants would be damaged. Small animals exposed on the surface would be killed. The entire food web would be disrupted. For humans, this would create a double threat. Direct radiation exposure would increase illness and death rates. But the collapse of food sources would be the bigger killer. Just like with the volcanic winter scenario, you'd see cascading failures throughout the ecosystem. The difference is that a radiation event wouldn't leave the dramatic cooling signature of a volcanic eruption. The climate might remain relatively stable even as life on the surface struggled. The more extreme version of this theory involves a supernova or gamma ray burst. If a star within a few hundred light years of Earth exploded, or if a gamma ray burst happened to be pointed our way, the radiation dose would be far more severe than any solar storm. We're talking about an event that could strip away significant portions of Earth's atmosphere in a matter of hours. The ozone layer would be completely destroyed. Surface radiation would reach lethal levels. Most complex life would die within weeks. The evidence for this theory is, frankly, pretty thin. We have no way to directly detect whether a supernova occurred 900,000 years ago, unless it was extremely close, and even then, we'd need to find isotopes in ice cores or ocean sediments that are incredibly difficult to detect at that timescale. Solar storms don't leave much geological evidence either. We can see their effects in tree rings and ice cores from recent centuries, but extracting that data from 900,000 years ago is virtually impossible with current technology. That said, we know cosmic events have affected Earth in the past. There's good evidence that a supernova about 2.6 million years ago may have contributed to the cooling that started the Pleistocene ice ages, and we know from studying other planets that solar storms can have dramatic effects on atmospheres. Mars lost most of its atmosphere partly because it lacks a strong magnetic field to deflect solar wind, so the mechanisms are real, even if we can't prove this specific event happened. Theory number 4 is the pandemic disease hypothesis. This is the biological nightmare scenario. The idea that a pathogen, a virus or bacteria, swept through human populations and killed nearly everyone it infected. Something like the Black Death or smallpox, but even more deadly and occurring long before humans developed any kind of medical knowledge. Here's why this theory is terrifying. Disease outbreaks can be devastatingly effective at reducing populations, especially in small scattered groups. Modern examples show how quickly epidemics can spread. The 1918 flu pandemic infected a third of the world's population in less than 2 years. HIV/AIDS killed tens of millions before we developed treatments, and those happened in populations with modern medicine, global communication, and some understanding of disease transmission. Imagine a similar outbreak hitting small bands of early humans who had no concept of germs or quarantine. An infected individual wouldn't be isolated. They'd be cared for by their family, spreading the disease to everyone in their group. As those family members visited neighbouring groups for trade or social interaction, they carry the pathogen with them. Within a single season, a disease could spread across an entire continent. For this to cause the bottleneck we see in the genetic record, the disease would need to be both highly lethal and extremely contagious. It would need to kill 98-99% of those infected, but spread slowly enough that a few scattered populations in isolated refugees could avoid exposure entirely. That's a narrow epidemiological window, but it's not impossible. Some diseases like Ebola have extremely high mortality rates but require close contact to spread. Others, like measles, are incredibly contagious but less deadly. A pathogen that combined both traits could theoretically produce the population crash we're trying to explain. The genetic evidence offers some tantalizing hints. Modern humans show signs of ancient selection on immune system genes, suggesting our ancestors faced severe disease pressure at some point. Some researchers have found evidence of what they call immune system sweeps, periods when natural selection rapidly favoured certain immune genes over others. One of these sweeps appears to have occurred around the time of the bottleneck. This suggests that disease was indeed a major factor in who survived and who didn't. But here's the problem with the pandemic theory. Diseases don't fossilise. We have no way to directly detect a pathogen from 900,000 years ago. Even with modern DNA sequencing technology, recovering genetic material from prehistoric microorganisms is incredibly difficult. We've managed to sequence plague bacteria from medieval skeletons and flu viruses from century-old tissue samples. But that's nowhere near the timescales we're dealing with here. The best we can do is look at patterns of genetic selection in modern populations and try to work backwards to infer what diseases might have been present. There's another issue. Most epidemic diseases that affect humans originated from domesticated animals. Measles came from cattle, influenza from pigs and birds, smallpox probably from camels. But 900,000 years ago, humans hadn't domesticated any animals yet. We were still hunter-gatherers. So where would a human-specific epidemic disease come from? It would need to be a pathogen that jumped directly from wild animals to humans, found us to be excellent hosts and spread rapidly through our populations. Not impossible, but less likely than the zoonotic diseases that have plagued us since the agricultural revolution. Theory number 5 is rapid climate oscillation. This is like the glaciation theory on steroids. The idea is that rather than a single catastrophic event or a slow, grinding climate shift, what killed most of humanity was a series of rapid, violent swings between different climate states. Droughts that lasted decades followed by massive flooding. Temperature spikes that turned grasslands into deserts, then sudden cooling that brought the forests back. Changes happening so quickly that no species could fully adapt. This theory is based on what we see in climate records from around the mid-Pleistocene transition. Ice cores and ocean sediments show something scientists call high-frequency variability. That's a technical way of saying the climate was going absolutely crazy. Within a single human lifetime, average temperatures could swing by 10 degrees Celsius. Rainfall patterns could shift from drought to deluge and back again. These weren't gradual changes taking thousands of years. They were rapid shocks happening every few decades. For early humans, this would mean that the survival strategies that worked for your parents might be completely useless by the time you had children. The plants that provided food during one decade might die out in the next. The water sources your group depended on could dry up, forcing constant migration into new territories. The animals you hunted might change their migration patterns or go locally extinct. You couldn't develop specialised survival strategies because the environment wouldn't stay stable long enough for specialisation to work. This creates what ecologists call an extinction vortex. Population declines from one environmental shock, reduce genetic diversity, and make the population more vulnerable to the next shock. Each successive crisis hits a smaller, weaker population, until finally the numbers get so low that random chance alone could finish them off. This matches exactly what we see in the genetic record. A population that shrank rapidly and stayed small for over 100,000 years, suggesting not a single catastrophic event but sustained pressure over multiple generations. The evidence for this theory is probably the strongest of all five. Climate records definitively show extreme variability during the mid-Pleistocene transition. We know this instability affected Africa, where most early humans lived. We can see from fossil records that other species were also stressed during this period, though none as severely as humans, and the timeline matches perfectly. The climate chaos begins right when the bottleneck starts and continues for roughly the same duration. But the climate oscillation theory has its own weakness. It doesn't explain why humans were so much more affected than other species. Sure, climate instability is hard on everyone. But to cause a 99% population crash specifically in humans suggests we were uniquely vulnerable for some reason. Maybe we had become too specialised, too dependent on particular resources or habitats. Maybe our larger brains and extended childhoods made us less able to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Maybe it was just bad luck, that the specific changes that occurred hit the resources we depended on hardest. We can speculate, but we don't know. Here's what's really frustrating and fascinating about all these theories. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, the most likely explanation is that multiple factors combine to create a perfect storm of extinction pressures. Maybe it started with the mid-Pleistocene transition creating climate chaos. Then a supervolcano erupted, or a solar storm hit, making an already bad situation catastrophic. In the chaos, a disease spread through the weakened, scattered populations, killing most of the survivors. Each individual factor might not have been enough to cause a 99% population crash, but all of them together, hitting within a relatively short time period, could absolutely do it. This is what scientists call a compound catastrophe. Multiple independent disasters that happen to cluster together, amplifying each other's effects. It's like getting hit by an earthquake, then a tsunami, then a pandemic all in the same decade. Each one would be terrible on its own, but together they're civilization ending, or in this case, species ending. We may never know exactly what happened 900,000 years ago. The evidence is too fragmentary, the timescales too vast, the geological record too incomplete. What we do know is that something pushed humanity to the absolute brink of extinction, reduced us to a population so small that we should have died out entirely. The fact that we're here today means that somehow, against impossible odds, a handful of survivors found a way to endure, to persist through more than 100,000 years of hardship that killed 99% of their species. The smoking gun may be lost to time, but the bullet wound is written in our DNA. Every human alive today carries the genetic signature of that ancient catastrophe. We're all descendants of those roughly 1,280 survivors who somehow made it through the worst crisis in human history. What they endured, how they survived, and what it cost them is the story we're still trying to piece together from fragments of evidence scattered across 1,000,000 years. The Dark Century, 117,000 years on the brink of extinction, 117,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. Not 117 days, not 117 months, but 117,000 years of hanging on by the thinnest possible thread. That's 5,150 generations of humans who woke up every morning in a world where their entire species could be wiped out by a single bad season, a single epidemic, a single unlucky encounter with predators. To put this in perspective, all of recorded human history, everything from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the moon landing, spans only about 5,000 years. The bottleneck lasted 23 times longer than that. If you tried to count out 117,000 years in seconds, it would take you 3.7 years of non-stop counting, just to mark the time it took for our species to stop being functionally extinct. And during all those millennia, the entire global human population was smaller than the number of people who can fit in a typical modern high school. 10,280 individuals. That's not just one village. That's barely 4 or 5 extended family groups trying to maintain a species across an entire continent. Think about what that means practically. Every human being alive during the bottleneck probably knew, or at least knew of, every other human being on Earth. When someone died, it wasn't a statistic, it was a catastrophic loss to the entire species. When a child was born, the whole human world celebrated, because that child represented an increase in the total human population of nearly 0.1%. The isolation would have been crushing in ways we can barely imagine. Modern humans are social creatures. We're built for communities of hundreds or thousands. Our brains are wired to maintain complex social networks, to gossip and share information, to learn from diverse role models and teachers. But during the bottleneck, there were no diverse communities. There were a handful of desperate survivors, probably clustered in 2 or 3 isolated refugee zones, each group numbering in the low hundreds at best. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests these refuge populations were most likely located in equatorial Africa, probably in the Great Rift Valley region of East Africa. This area had several advantages that would have made survival possible even during the worst climate conditions. Deep lakes that wouldn't completely dry up even during extended droughts. Cave systems that provided shelter from temperature extremes. Diverse topography that created microclimates. Small areas where conditions might remain tolerable, even when the surrounding regions became uninhabitable. Some researchers think there might have been a second refuge population further south, possibly in what's now South Africa, near the Cape region. This area has evidence of continuous human occupation during the bottleneck period, and its coastal location would have provided access to marine resources when terrestrial food sources failed. But whether there were 2 refugee zones or 3, the reality was the same. These small groups were completely isolated from each other. Travel between refuges would have been incredibly dangerous, crossing hundreds of miles of hostile, resource-poor terrain. Most groups probably went years, maybe decades, without encountering other humans outside their immediate community. This isolation created genetic problems that would have threatened survival almost as much as the environmental crisis itself. With only 1,280 individuals total, and those individuals divided into separate populations, the effective breeding population of any single group might have been as low as 200 people. That's a genetic nightmare. Every human carries some deleterious recessive genes, mutations that are harmless when you have 1 copy, but dangerous or lethal when you inherit 2 copies. In a large population, these genes remain rare because the chances of 2 carriers meeting and reproducing are relatively low. But in a tiny population where everyone is related, the odds of inheriting 2 copies of a bad gene skyrocket. The bottleneck survivors would have started seeing this within a few generations. Birth defects that are rare in normal populations would have become common. Genetic disorders that usually affect 1 in 10,000 births might have shown up in 1 in 50. Every family group would have had members with developmental problems, compromised immune systems, or subtle but significant genetic weaknesses. Some genetic lineages probably went extinct entirely. If a family group had particularly bad luck with disease or accidents, wiping out all their children before they could reproduce, those specific genetic variants disappeared forever. And with them went potential adaptations, genetic diversity that might have proven useful later. The survivors had to make brutal choices. Inbreeding was inevitable, but they probably developed cultural practices to minimize the worst effects. Taboos against the closest degree of incest, father-daughter, brother-sister matings, might have emerged not from moral reasoning, but from the practical observation that such unions produce too many non-viable children. Groups might have made dangerous journeys to other refugee populations specifically to find unrelated marriage partners, trading their sons and daughters to maintain genetic diversity. But even with these strategies, the genetic damage was accumulating. Every generation saw the human gene pool shrinking a little more. Rare genetic variants were being lost to random chance, a process called genetic drift. When a population is large, genetic drift has minimal effect, because rare genes have thousands of carriers. But in a population of 1,280, a rare gene might have only 10 or 20 carriers. If those specific individuals happened not to reproduce, or if their children all died young, that gene vanished forever. We can still see the scars of this genetic erosion in modern human DNA. Compared to other great apes, humans have remarkably low genetic diversity. Chimpanzees, despite having much smaller total populations today, have 3 to 4 times more genetic variation than humans do. 2 chimps from the same forest in Africa are more genetically different from each other than any 2 humans anywhere on Earth. This lack of diversity makes us vulnerable as a species. It's why human populations can be devastated by diseases that other primates shrug off. It's why we show much less variation in traits like immune response, metabolic efficiency, and resistance to environmental toxins. The bottleneck didn't just reduce our numbers, it reduced our evolutionary options, narrowing the range of genetic tools we have available to deal with future challenges. But the survivors weren't thinking about long-term evolutionary consequences. They were focused on getting through the next season, the next year, the next generation. And that daily struggle was brutal in ways that would break most modern humans within weeks. Imagine being one of those bottleneck survivors. You're living in a small cave system with maybe 30 other people, 3 or 4 family groups who have banded together because isolation means death. Half the caves are occupied by rival groups who you avoid because conflict over limited resources could wipe out either group. Every day starts with the same question: what can we eat today? The megafauna your grandparents hunted are mostly gone, either extinct or migrated to distant regions. Large game hunts are rare, desperate affairs that risk injury or death to hunters your group can't afford to lose. Instead, you focus on smaller prey, rodents, birds, lizards, anything that can be caught without too much danger. Plant foods are scarce and seasonal. The climate swings have disrupted normal growing patterns. Plants that used to produce reliable nut or fruit crops now fail most years. Your people have learned to eat foods that previous generations would have rejected. Bitter tubers that need extensive processing to be digestible. Insects that provide protein but require hours of gathering to collect enough to matter. Tree bark and roots during the worst times. Foods that provide barely enough calories to justify the energy spent gathering them. Water is a constant concern. The lakes and rivers your ancestors relied on are unreliable now. Some years they flow normally, other years they dry up completely, forcing your group to dig desperately in dry riverbeds hoping to find underground seeps. People die of dehydration regularly, especially the elderly and the very young, whose bodies can't handle prolonged water stress. Disease is a constant shadow. With everyone living in close quarters, Infection spread rapidly through your small group. Your population is too small to maintain most epidemic diseases. Measles, smallpox, diseases that require large populations to persist, don't exist yet. But parasites, bacterial infections and fungal diseases are everywhere. Contaminated water causes dysentery. Wounds become infected and turn fatal. Respiratory infections in the cold season kill the weak, and because your population is so small, there are no specialists, no experts, no one who can focus entirely on developing medical knowledge or perfecting healing techniques. Everyone has to contribute to basic survival. That person who might have become a brilliant herbalist in a larger society has to spend most of their time gathering food, making tools, processing hides. Knowledge accumulates slowly, and when someone dies unexpectedly, their specialized skills might die with them. The same problem affects technology. Human progress is supposed to build on itself, each generation learning from the previous one and adding improvements. But in a population of around 280, spread across multiple isolated groups, technological knowledge is fragile. A drought kills off an extended family, and with them goes the knowledge of how to make a particular type of tool, or where to find a specific medicinal plant, or how to process a certain kind of food. Your ancestors knew more than you do. That's a horrifying realization that would have haunted Bottleneck survivors. The generation that entered the crisis had been part of thriving populations hundreds of thousands strong. They had sophisticated tool technologies, extensive knowledge of their environments, complex social structures. But as the population crashed, that knowledge base was fragmenting. You might have old tools that your grandmother made, beautifully crafted implements that you can't quite reproduce, because she died before teaching you all the techniques. You might have story about abundant hunting grounds that no one alive can remember how to reach. You might have vague cultural memories of celebrations and rituals that made sense in larger communities, but seem pointless when your entire human world consists of 40 people scattered across 3 cave systems. This loss of cultural knowledge made recovery even harder. Even if environmental conditions improved, even if the rains returned and the vegetation recovered, your reduced population couldn't immediately exploit those resources because you'd forgotten how. Previous generations might have known systematic fire drive hunting techniques that required dozens of coordinated hunters. But with only 5 or 6 adult males in your group, those techniques are useless. You have to develop new strategies for smaller numbers. Toolmaking suffers from the same problem. Sophisticated stone tools require specialized knowledge and hundreds of hours of practice to master. In a large population, you can afford to have expert craftspeople who focus on toolmaking while others hunt and gather. But in your tiny group, everyone has to be mediocre at everything. The tools are functional but crude. Good enough to survive, but not good enough to thrive. The psychological toll of the bottleneck would have been almost unbearable. These weren't just humans struggling to survive. These were humans who understood at some level that their entire species was failing. They could see that their population was smaller than it used to be. They had stories from grandparents about times when many more people lived in the region. They could find abandoned campsites and cave shelters that showed evidence of previous human occupation, but that now stood empty and silent. Think about going to sleep every night knowing that if your particular family group fails, if a disease sweeps through your cave, if a flash flood catches everyone together, if a large predator ambushes your hunters, humanity might not recover. The weight of that knowledge would have been crushing. Every decision would be potentially species-ending. Should we explore that valley looking for food? Or is the risk of losing hunters too great? Should we fight that rival group for access to the water source? Or will the conflict weaken both groups beyond recovery? Children during the bottleneck grew up in a world of constant loss. Most probably lost siblings to disease or accidents. Many lost parents and had to be raised by aunts, uncles or distant relatives. The typical family structure we think of as normal, two parents raising multiple children together, was probably uncommon. Extended family groups shared child-rearing responsibilities because no single nuclear family could afford the risk of concentrating all parental investment in one partnership. Childhood would have been brief. By age 7 or 8, children would be contributing meaningfully to food gathering. By their early teens, they'd be fully functioning adults, because the group couldn't afford to support non-productive members any longer than absolutely necessary. Education was focused entirely on survival skills, how to find water, how to identify edible plants, how to make fire, how to create basic tools, how to read animal tracks, how to avoid predators. There was no time for the exploratory play that helps develop creativity in modern children. No time for art or music or storytelling beyond the bare minimum needed to pass on essential knowledge. The archaeological record from the Bottleneck period shows a striking absence of what archaeologists call symbolic artifacts. No cave paintings, no decorative objects, no evidence of ritual or ceremony. This doesn't mean the people were less intelligent. It means they were too desperate to spend energy on anything that didn't directly contribute to immediate survival. And yet, somehow, they held on. For 5,150 generations, these tiny populations clung to existence. They watched their numbers hover at the edge of extinction. They experienced periodic crashes when disease or bad seasons reduced them even further. They must have gone through decades where births didn't replace deaths, where the human population actually declined below that 280 threshold. But they never quite went extinct. Some groups found ways to maintain just enough genetic diversity to avoid complete inbreeding collapse. Some populations managed to maintain just enough contact with other groups to occasionally exchange members and refresh their gene pools. Some individuals proved just adaptable enough, just resourceful enough, just lucky enough to survive and reproduce. The recovery took so long partly because of biology. When a population gets reduced below a certain threshold, growth becomes exponential but slow. Even if conditions improve, even if every breeding pair successfully raises 2 or 3 children to adulthood, population growth is constrained by the number of reproductive females. With a total population of 1,280, maybe 300 of those are females of reproductive age. If each has 3 children over their lifetime, and all those children survive to reproduce, the population grows to about 1,900 in one generation, then to about 2,800 the next generation, then to about 4,200. That seems like good growth, but remember each generation is about 20 years. So after 60 years of perfect conditions, your population has only increased from 1,280 to 4,200. You're still a functionally extinct species that could be wiped out by a single volcanic eruption or epidemic. It takes centuries of sustained growth before the population becomes large enough to be stable. And during the bottleneck, conditions were never perfect for centuries at a time. Instead, there were brief periods of improvement followed by new climate disasters that knocked the population back down. The environment itself was working against recovery. Even after the worst of the crisis passed, Africa remained climatically unstable. The same factors that had triggered the bottleneck, volcanic activity, weakened monsoon patterns, disrupted ocean currents, continued affecting weather patterns for tens of thousands of years. Droughts remained common, food resources remained unpredictable. The survivors couldn't count on stable conditions lasting long enough for real population growth. But perhaps the most important factor was the loss of what biologists call ecological release. In normal evolution, when a species develops successful adaptations, its population expands rapidly until it reaches the carrying capacity of its environment. But the bottleneck survivors were never reaching carrying capacity because the carrying capacity itself kept collapsing. Every time the population started to grow, environmental conditions would deteriorate again and the growing population would crash back down. This pattern continued for over 100,000 years. Brief periods of expansion followed by devastating crashes. Slow growth interrupted by catastrophic die-offs. The human population probably peaked and crashed dozens of times during the bottleneck, roller coastering between 800 individuals and 2,000 individuals without ever achieving the sustained growth needed to escape the danger zone. The genetic evidence suggests there were at least 3 or 4 major near-extinction events during the bottleneck period. Times when the population dropped so low that modern geneticists can see the signature in our DNA, sudden losses of genetic diversity that mark catastrophic population reductions. Each time, somehow, enough people survived to keep the species alive, but each time a little more genetic diversity was lost. A few, more rare genetic variants disappeared. The human gene pool grew shallower, and through it all, the survivors endured. They watched their children struggle. They buried family members. They migrated when conditions became intolerable, abandoning traditional territories to search for more livable regions. They adapted their technology, their diet, their social structures, whatever it took to squeeze out a few more years of survival. They didn't have the comfort of knowing their ordeal would eventually end. They couldn't see into the future and know that 117,000 years later, their descendants would number in the billions. From their perspective, this was just life. The constant struggle, the precarious balance, the daily uncertainty that was normal. The old stories about abundant times might have seemed like myths, comfortable lies the elders told to give people hope. But those 5,850 generations of survivors did something remarkable. They created a genetic filter that would fundamentally shape the future of humanity. Natural selection during the bottleneck favoured very specific traits. Intelligence, because survival required constant problem solving. Social cooperation, because isolated individuals died quickly. Behavioural flexibility, because rigid strategies failed when conditions kept changing. Capacity for innovation, because traditional knowledge kept being lost and had to be redeveloped. The humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't just survivors. They were the descendants of the most adaptable, most intelligent, most socially capable members of their species, refined by over 100,000 years of the most intense selection pressure humanity has ever experienced. Every person alive today carries genes that survive that filter, genetic variants that were tested in the crucible of near extinction and proved capable of enduring the unendurable. But the immediate legacy was simpler and darker. After 117,000 years of desperate survival, the human species was finally ready to begin recovering. The climate was stabilizing, food sources were becoming more reliable, and the population, battered and reduced, was about to begin the slow climb back from the brink. The dark century was ending. But the species that emerged would be forever marked by the experience of those millennia balanced on the edge of extinction. The recovery. How humanity clawed back from the abyss. Around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The climate that had nearly destroyed humanity began to stabilize. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The brutal droughts became less frequent. The temperature swings less extreme. The ecosystem, devastated by over 100 millennia of chaos, started to heal. For the survivors scattered across their shrinking refugees in Africa, this shift meant everything. Remember, these weren't large populations we're talking about. The genetic evidence suggests the breeding population had remained at or below 1,280 individuals for 117,000 years. That's roughly the size of a small village spread across an entire continent. Every birth was precious, every death was catastrophic. The margin for error was essentially zero. But now, for the first time in living memory, in their grandparents' memory, in the memory of ancestors stretching back hundreds of generations, the world was becoming less hostile, and humanity began to respond. The recovery didn't happen overnight. This wasn't a Hollywood moment where the heroes emerge from their bunker to a bright new world. The expansion from near extinction back to sustainable population levels took tens of thousands of years. Slow, grinding, uncertain progress punctuated by setbacks and local extinctions. But the trend was unmistakable. Humanity was clawing its way back from the abyss. The genetic evidence for this recovery is written in our DNA like pages in a history book. When geneticists analyse human genetic diversity, they can see the signature of population expansion beginning around 813,000 years ago. The pattern is subtle, but clear. New genetic variants start appearing more frequently. The rate of mutation accumulation accelerates. The genetic markers that indicate population bottlenecks begin to fade. Think of it like this. During the bottleneck, the human gene pool was like a library that had lost most of its books. Only the most essential texts remained. Survival manuals that had proven their worth under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But as the population expanded, new books started being written. Mutations, the random changes in DNA that happen in every generation, began accumulating again. Not every mutation was beneficial. Most were neutral, some were harmful. But collectively they represented something profound. Genetic diversity was returning. This diversity was life insurance for the species. During the bottleneck, humanity had been terrifyingly vulnerable to any new threat. One novel disease, one additional climate shock, one evolutionary dead end, and it could have been over. But with each generation of expansion, with each new mutation that survived and spread, humanity was building resilience. The gene pool was deepening. The options were multiplying. Within a few thousand years, the breeding population had probably doubled, then doubled again. Archaeological evidence from this period is frustratingly sparse. We're talking about finding needles in haystacks that are the size of continents and nearly 1 million years old. But the sites we do have tell a story of gradual expansion. Stone tool assemblages start appearing in regions where they'd been absent for millennia. Cave sites that show no sign of human occupation during the bottleneck suddenly contain evidence of regular use. The survivors were spreading out, reclaiming territories their ancestors had abandoned. But they weren't the same people who had nearly gone extinct. The bottleneck had changed them in ways that would shape human evolution forever. Natural selection, operating at maximum intensity for over 100,000 years, had left its mark on the human genome. The survivors weren't just lucky, they were different. Here's what we think happened. During those desperate millennia, certain traits that had been merely advantageous before the crisis became absolutely essential. Intelligence, obviously. The ability to solve novel problems, to figure out new food sources when familiar ones disappeared, to remember complex information about seasonal patterns and resource locations, but also cooperation. In times of extreme scarcity, groups that could work together effectively had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. Sharing food during hard times, coordinating hunts for scarce game, caring for the sick and injured instead of abandoning them. The bottleneck would have selected intensely for these cooperative tendencies. Groups that fractured under pressure, that descended into conflict over diminishing resources, probably didn't make it. The ancestors of modern humanity were the ones who figured out how to stick together when everything was falling apart. They were also the ones who could innovate under pressure. The archaeological record from the Bottleneck period shows something remarkable. Despite the catastrophic population collapse, despite resources being scarcer than they'd ever been, stone tool technology actually became more sophisticated. The simple, basic tools that had served earlier humans for millions of years were being replaced by more complex, more specialised implements. Carefully shaped hand axes, precisely flaked cutting tools, implements designed for specific tasks rather than general purpose use. This wasn't random. This was adaptation through innovation. The survivors were the ones who could look at a problem and think creatively about solutions, who could take familiar materials and use them in new ways, who could learn complex techniques and critically teach them to others. This is where language probably became truly essential. You can teach someone to chip rocks together through demonstration, but teaching the subtle techniques for creating specialised stone tools, for recognising high-quality raw materials, for understanding the properties of different types of stone, that requires communication. Detailed, precise, abstract communication, the kind that only sophisticated language makes possible. The genetic evidence suggests the bottleneck created intense selection pressure for brain development related to language. Certain genes involved in speech production and language processing show signs of having been under strong selective pressure during this exact period. Natural selection was favouring individuals who could communicate more effectively, because in a world where survival margins were razor thin, the ability to share knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. So the humans who emerged from the bottleneck weren't just survivors. They were a new kind of human, smarter, more cooperative, more innovative, more articulate than their predecessors. The crisis had refined humanity like nothing before or since, and as the population began expanding, these traits spread with it. Every new generation carried the genetic legacy of bottleneck survival. Every new band that split off from growing populations carried the cultural knowledge that had enabled survival through impossible odds. By 700,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years into the recovery, the human population had probably reached tens of thousands of individuals, still tiny by modern standards. The entire human species could have fit inside a modest-sized sports stadium. But compared to 1,280, this was spectacular success, and the expansion was accelerating. Here's where things get really interesting. As populations grew and spread across Africa, they began encountering environmental diversity that hadn't been accessible during the bottleneck. The survivors had clung to a handful of refuges, probably river valleys and coastal areas where water was reliably available. But their descendants were expanding into grasslands, woodlands, mountains, different climate zones, different ecosystems, different challenges, and different opportunities. This environmental diversity drove what geneticists call the founder effect. Small groups splitting off from the main population and establishing themselves in new territories. Each founder population would carry only a subset of the total genetic variation available in the parent population, and each would face slightly different selection pressures in their new environment. Some groups adapted to hot, dry grasslands, becoming more efficient at water conservation. Others moved into cooler, wetter regions where different survival skills were needed. Some became specialists in hunting large game. Others developed expertise in fishing or gathering plant foods. The result was the beginning of human population structure. Not different species, but distinct populations with their own genetic characteristics, their own cultural traditions, their own adaptive strategies. This diversity within unity would become a defining feature of humanity, all sharing the common inheritance of bottleneck survival, but each population adding its own variations to the theme. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing technological sophistication. The stone tools become more refined, more specialised, more carefully crafted. But more importantly, they start showing regional variation. Tool assemblages from East Africa look different from those in South Africa, which look different from those in North Africa. This isn't just random. It's evidence of distinct cultural traditions emerging. Groups developing their own ways of doing things, their own technical knowledge that's passed down through generations. This is the signature of true culture, not just instinctive behaviour or individual learning, but socially transmitted knowledge that can accumulate and improve over time. The survivors of the Bottleneck had carried culture with them through the crisis. Now their descendants were expanding it, elaborating it, creating new cultural traditions adapted to new environments. Around 600,000 years ago, approximately 300,000 years into the recovery, humanity reached another crucial threshold. This is when we start seeing evidence of what would eventually become Homo heidelbergensis, a species that many anthropologists consider the last common ancestor of modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Now, the taxonomy here gets complicated and controversial. Some researchers think Homo heidelbergensis was a distinct species. Others think it's just a label we apply to a transitional period in human evolution, when different populations were diverging, but hadn't yet become separate species. But regardless of what we call them, the humans living around 600,000 years ago were notably different from those who had entered the Bottleneck. They had larger brains, averaging about 200 cubic centimetres compared to about 900 for early Homo erectus. Their skulls were more rounded, their faces less projecting, their bodies more gracile, less robustly built, and most importantly, they were behaviourally more sophisticated. The archaeological sites from this period show evidence of controlled use of fire, not just opportunistic use of natural fires, but deliberate fire-making and maintenance. This is huge. Fire provides warmth, protection from predators, the ability to cook food, which makes it more digestible and releases more nutrients. Fire extends the day, allowing activity after dark. It creates a social focal point where groups can gather, share food, tell stories. The emergence of systematic fire use suggests these post-Bottleneck humans had developed the cognitive abilities and cultural practices necessary to maintain complex technologies across generations. Firemaking isn't easy. It requires specific knowledge, specific materials, specific techniques. You have to learn it from someone who already knows how, and you have to teach it to the next generation. This is cultural transmission at its most essential. We also see evidence of more sophisticated hunting strategies. Kill sites with remains of multiple large animals, suggesting coordinated group hunts. Butchery marks on bones showing systematic processing of carcasses to extract maximum nutrition. Transport of resources over significant distances, indicating planning and delayed gratification. These humans weren't just reacting to immediate circumstances anymore. They were planning ahead, anticipating future needs, organising complex group activities. They were thinking abstractly about time and causation. But perhaps most remarkable, the genetic evidence suggests this is when human populations began the process that would eventually lead to speciation. Remember, the Bottleneck had created a genetically uniform population. All the survivors were closely related, all carrying virtually identical DNA. But as populations expanded and spread across Africa, then eventually beyond Africa, they began accumulating genetic differences. Groups in different regions faced different selection pressures. A mutation that was advantageous in one environment might be neutral or even harmful in another. Over time, these differences accumulated, not enough to create separate species yet. That would take hundreds of thousands of years more, but enough to create population structure, genetic variation, the raw material from which new species could eventually emerge. By 500,000 years ago, human populations probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands across Africa. The recovery from near extinction was essentially complete. Humanity had climbed back from the precipice and was thriving again. But the shadow of the bottleneck remained. Human genetic diversity, even after 500,000 years of population expansion, was still lower than it had been before the crisis. That lost diversity could never be fully recovered. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, carry less genetic variation than a single troop of chimpanzees. That's the permanent mark the bottleneck left on our species. But if the bottleneck took something away, it also gave something back. Those 117,000 years of evolutionary pressure had forged a new kind of human. More intelligent, more cooperative, more innovative, more communicative than any human that had come before. The price was nearly extinction. The reward was the traits that would eventually allow humanity to dominate the planet. Around 400,000 years ago, human populations began expanding beyond Africa for the first time since the bottleneck. Small groups crossing into the Middle East, then Europe and Asia. These early migrations would seed the populations that would eventually become Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. But the main African population remained, continuing to evolve along its own trajectory. These were the ancestors of Homo sapiens, us, the descendants of bottleneck survivors who had stayed in Africa, adapting to the diverse and challenging environments of the continent where humanity was born. Over the next several 100,000 years, this African population continued developing the traits that would define modern humans. The archaeological record shows steadily increasing sophistication. Stone tools become lighter, sharper, more efficient. Sites show evidence of organised living spaces, areas designated for tool making, food processing, sleeping, hearths for cooking and warmth. By 300,000 years ago, we start seeing the earliest fossils that look recognisably modern. High, rounded skulls. Faces that sit flat beneath the skull rather than projecting forward. Gracile bone structure. These are the earliest Homo sapiens, and they're found exclusively in Africa. For the next 250,000 years, modern humans remained in Africa, continuing to evolve, continuing to innovate. The archaeological record from this period shows the emergence of increasingly sophisticated behaviours. The first definite evidence of art, ochre crayons used for drawing, carefully crafted bone tools, shell beads used as personal ornaments, systematic use of pigments, evidence of trade networks moving materials hundreds of miles. These weren't just surviving anymore, they were creating culture, developing identity, expressing themselves symbolically. Then, around 60,000 years ago, something changed. A small group of modern humans left Africa, crossing into the Middle East. This wasn't the first time humans had left Africa. Remember, Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestors had left hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But this exodus was different. These modern humans carried with them the full package of behavioural sophistication that had been developing in Africa for 300,000 years. And they had the demographic and technological advantages to spread rapidly. Within 40,000 years, modern humans had reached every corner of the globe except Antarctica. They displaced or absorbed the Neanderthals in Europe. They interbred with Denisovans in Asia. They crossed seas to reach Australia. They walked across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. And everywhere they went, they brought with them the genetic legacy of the bottleneck. Every person alive today is a direct descendant of those 180 survivors who clung to existence 900,000 years ago. We carry their genes. We inherit the traits that natural selection refined during those desperate millennia. The intelligence, the creativity, the capacity for cooperation, the linguistic abilities, all of it forged in the crucible of near extinction. The recovery from the bottleneck wasn't just about population numbers returning to pre-crisis levels. It was about humanity emerging from the experience fundamentally transformed, stronger, smarter, more resilient. The crisis had nearly destroyed us. But what didn't kill us made us unlike any species that had ever existed. We had clawed our way back from the abyss, and in doing so, we had become something new, something unprecedented, something that would, for better or worse, reshape the entire planet. The age of human dominance didn't begin with agriculture or cities or civilization. It began 813,000 years ago, when a handful of survivors in Africa looked at a world that had tried to kill them and decided they weren't done yet. Everything that came after, every human achievement, every civilization, every technological breakthrough traces back to that moment. When humanity, reduced to its absolute minimum, chose to fight for survival, and won. Legacy of the Bottleneck, how ancient catastrophe shaped modern humanity. So here we are, 900,000 years after the greatest catastrophe in human history. 7 billion people spread across every corner of the planet. Dominant species of Earth, masters of our environment. It's easy to look around at modern humanity and think we're invincible, that we've somehow transcended the natural laws that govern other species. But the genetic evidence tells a very different story. Every single person alive today carries the molecular signature of that ancient bottleneck, not as a historical footnote, but as a defining characteristic of what it means to be human. That near-extinction event didn't just almost kill us. It shaped everything about us. Our biology, our psychology, our strengths, and most importantly, our vulnerabilities. Let's start with something that surprises most people. Humans are remarkably genetically similar to each other. Way more similar than we should be for a species that numbers in the billions and lives across every climate zone on the planet. Take chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. A typical group of 50 chimps living in a single forest in Central Africa has more genetic diversity than all 7 billion humans combined. Let that sink in for a moment. 50 individuals in a few square miles have more genetic variation than every human from the Arctic to the Sahara, from Tokyo to Toronto, from the Australian outback to the Amazon rainforest. Or look at gorillas. Different gorilla populations separated by just a few hundred miles show genetic differences that dwarf the variation between a Norwegian and a Nigerian, a Chinese person and a Cherokee, a Maori and a Moroccan. This is the bottleneck's most obvious legacy. When you reduce a population to 280 individuals for 117,000 years, you don't just create a survival test. You create a genetic funnel that squeezes out diversity. Every neutral mutation, every random variation that doesn't directly contribute to survival, gets filtered away. What emerges on the other side is a population that's genetically streamlined, carrying only the essential genetic machinery needed to survive the worst crisis imaginable. Modern humans aren't diverse because we never had the chance to become diverse. The bottleneck erased hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated genetic variation. Then, when our ancestors finally expanded out of that crisis, they did so too quickly for significant new diversity to develop. You can see this in the genetic data from modern populations. The entire human species has something like 0.1% genetic variation between individuals. For most species, that number would be 10 times higher. We're all essentially cousins. Distant cousins, sure, but cousins nonetheless. A European and an Australian Aboriginal person, despite looking quite different and having ancestors who separated maybe 50,000 years ago, share something like 99.9% of their DNA. That's not normal. That's the genetic signature of a species that almost died. But this similarity has consequences beyond just interesting statistics. It has real, measurable effects on human health, and not all of them are good. When a population crashes to a few thousand individuals, genetic diseases that were rare become common. Not because the crisis caused mutations, but because simple mathematics changed the equation. In a large diverse population, harmful genetic variants get diluted. If you carry a gene that causes problems, it doesn't spread widely because it's just one variant among millions. But in a tiny population, every genetic variant becomes proportionally more important. Some of the genetic diseases that plague modern humans probably reached high frequencies during the bottleneck. Sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs disease. These aren't new mutations. They're ancient variants that became common in small populations and never got filtered back out. Worse, some of these diseases persist because they have what geneticists call heterozygote advantage. If you inherit one copy of the variant, you get some benefit. If you inherit 2 copies, you get sick. Sickle cell trait is the classic example. 1 copy gives you resistance to malaria. 2 copies cause sickle cell disease. During the bottleneck, when every advantage mattered, and the population was small enough that these variants could spread quickly, genes like this became embedded in the human genome. Today, millions of people carry them. Most never know it. But for those who inherit 2 copies, the legacy of the bottleneck is a lifetime of medical challenges. The bottleneck also affected our immune systems in ways we're only beginning to understand. When you reduce genetic diversity, you reduce immune system diversity. Different versions of immune genes protect against different diseases. In a diverse population, almost any pathogen will encounter some individuals whose immune systems can fight it effectively. But in a genetically similar population, a single disease can potentially affect everyone the same way. This is why modern humans are vulnerable to pandemics. When a new virus emerges, like the flu or COVID-19, it can spread through our species with devastating efficiency. We don't have the genetic diversity that would ensure some of us are naturally resistant. The bottleneck took that away. Some researchers think this vulnerability is even more extreme than we realise. There's evidence that humans went through not just one bottleneck 900,000 years ago, but several smaller ones since then. Each time, genetic diversity decreased a little more. Each time, we became a little more uniform, a little more vulnerable to species-wide catastrophes. But it's not all negative. The bottleneck also gave us some remarkable advantages. Remember, those 117,000 years were the ultimate selection event. Every individual who survived carried genes that were tested in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Genes for intelligence, cooperation, adaptability, resilience. These weren't just advantageous. They were essential. You literally couldn't survive without them. Modern, humans inherited this tested, refined genetic toolkit. We're the descendants of survivors, and that legacy shows up in unexpected ways. Humans are remarkably resilient compared to most species. We can survive in environments from the Arctic to the Sahara. We can adapt to radically different diets. We can recover from injuries that would kill most mammals our size. We can go weeks without food, days without water, and still maintain cognitive function well enough to solve complex problems. This isn't random. This is the bottleneck's legacy. Natural selection refined our ancestors' survival machinery so thoroughly that modern humans are essentially indestructible by mammalian standards. Not individually, obviously, we're still fragile in plenty of ways, but as a species we're incredibly hard to kill. Look at what humans have survived since the bottleneck. Ice ages, droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, plagues that killed a third of entire continents. Every time our species bounced back, often faster and stronger than before. That's not luck, that's genetic programming. The bottleneck selected for populations that could recover from disaster. Individuals whose psychology wouldn't break under impossible pressure. Social structures that could maintain cooperation even when resources were scarce. Reproductive strategies that could rapidly rebuild populations after catastrophic losses. We carry all of that in our DNA. Every human alive today is the product of an unbroken line of survivors stretching back through 900,000 years of challenges that would have destroyed most species. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the bottleneck is philosophical. It changes how we should think about human diversity and human unity. In our modern world, we focus a lot on differences. Different cultures, different ethnicities, different languages, different belief systems. And those differences are real and important. They make human civilization rich and complex and interesting. But the genetic evidence tells us something else equally important. Underneath all those surface differences, we're all the same people, not metaphorically, literally. The genetic distance between any two humans is so small that we're basically clones compared to the variation you see in most other species. That Norwegian and that Nigerian we mentioned earlier, genetically they're more similar to each other than two chimps from the same forest. That European and that Australian Aboriginal person. Closer genetic relatives than two gorillas from neighbouring mountains. Every human on Earth is descended from the same tiny population that survived the same catastrophe 900,000 years ago. We all carry the same chromosomal fusion. We all have the same genetic vulnerability to bottleneck-related diseases. We all inherited the same survival adaptations that carried our ancestors through those desperate millennia. The differences we see, skin colour, facial features, body proportions, those are superficial adaptations that developed over the last 60,000 years as humans spread into different environments. They're recent, shallow, cosmetic changes on top of a genetic foundation that's essentially uniform across the entire species. Race, as a genetic concept, barely exists in humans. The variation within any racial group is nearly as large as the variation between groups. You can't predict someone's genetics from their appearance with any real accuracy because the differences we can see don't correlate well with deeper genetic variation. The bottleneck made us all family. Close family. The kind of genetic similarity we show is what you'd expect from a species that expanded from a single small population very recently in evolutionary time, which is exactly what we are. This has implications beyond just science. It should change how we think about human conflict, human cooperation, human society. Every war, every genocide, every act of ethnic hatred is being committed against people who are, genetically speaking, nearly identical to the perpetrators. We're not fighting different species. We're not even fighting distant relatives. We're fighting our cousins over differences that are, from a genetic standpoint, almost meaningless. The bottleneck should have taught us that we're all in this together, because we almost weren't here at all. But it's not just ancient history. The bottleneck also warns us about modern vulnerabilities. The same lack of genetic diversity that makes us all family also makes us all vulnerable to the same threats. A supervirus that could infect one human could potentially infect all humans, because we don't have the immune diversity that would protect some percentage of the population. A global climate catastrophe would affect all human populations because we don't have the genetic variation that would let some groups tolerate extreme conditions better than others. We're playing a dangerous game with our environment and our technology. Nuclear weapons, climate change, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, artificial intelligence, engineered pandemics. Any one of these could potentially trigger another bottleneck event. And this time, with 7 billion people all crammed onto one planet using interconnected systems, the crash could be even more severe. The bottleneck 900,000 years ago happened slowly enough that at least some humans survived. A modern catastrophe, happening in years or decades instead of millennia, might not give us that chance. And we wouldn't have the same advantages our ancestors did. They survived through genetic diversity that had accumulated over millions of years. We've already spent that diversity. We're running on the genetic minimum, the essential toolkit that got refined during the last bottleneck. If we go through another one, we'll have even less variation to work with. Some scientists worry we're already seeing warning signs. Global human population has been growing exponentially for the last few centuries, but exponential growth can't continue forever. At some point we'll hit resource limits, environmental constraints. When that happens, populations crash. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The bottleneck teaches us that humans can survive incredible catastrophes, but it also teaches us that survival comes at a cost. Those 117,000 years stripped away most of what made our ancestors diverse. Another bottleneck would strip away more. Keep doing that, and eventually you end up with a species so genetically uniform that a single disease, a single environmental change, a single unforeseen challenge could end everything. We're not invincible, we're survivors. There's a difference. But the story of the bottleneck also gives us hope, because if our ancestors could survive the worst crisis in human history, with nothing but stone tools and animal skins, we can survive the challenges facing us now. We have all their genetic resilience plus 900,000 years of accumulated knowledge. We have technology, medicine, global communication networks, the ability to predict and prepare for disasters in ways they never could. The question is whether we'll use those advantages wisely. And the mystery isn't over. Every year, new genetic discoveries are revealing more about the bottleneck and its effects on modern humans. Advanced sequencing technologies are letting scientists examine ancient DNA from fossils that would have been impossible to study even a decade ago. We're finding evidence of population movements, interbreeding events, survival strategies that we never knew existed. Some recent discoveries are changing our understanding of the timeline itself. Early estimates suggested the bottleneck lasted about 100,000 years. But newer analysis of mutation rates and genetic diversity suggests it might have been longer. Maybe 150,000 years, maybe more. Every time we refine the models, the crisis looks a little worse, the survival a little more improbable. Other researchers are discovering that the bottleneck might not have been as uniform as we thought. Different human populations might have crashed at slightly different times or to slightly different degrees. There's tantalizing genetic evidence suggesting some groups might have maintained slightly larger populations, serving as genetic refugees that helped preserve diversity that would otherwise have been lost. We're also learning more about the specific genetic changes that occurred during the bottleneck. Not just the chromosomal fusion, but hundreds of other variants that became common during that period. Genes affecting brain development, immune function, temperature regulation, stress response. Each one tells part of the story of how our ancestors adapted to survive impossible conditions, and we're discovering that some of these genetic variants are still actively affecting modern humans in ways we never suspected. Variants that influence intelligence, that affect personality traits like risk-taking or cooperation, that determine how we respond to stress or form social bonds. The bottleneck didn't just shape our bodies, it shaped our minds, our psychology. The fundamental patterns of how we think and interact and experience the world. Every human alive carries this legacy. We're all products of that ancient catastrophe. Children of survivors who refused to give up even when extinction seemed inevitable. Beneficiaries of genetic refinements purchased at the cost of 117,000 years of desperate struggle. When you look at another human being, any human being, you're looking at someone who shares your genetic heritage almost completely. Someone whose ancestors survived the same crisis your ancestors survived. Someone who carries the same survival genes, the same vulnerabilities, the same potential. The differences between us, all the things we fight about, all the divisions we create, their evolutionary noise. Surface variations on a genetic foundation that's remarkably, almost impossibly uniform. The bottleneck made us all equal in the most literal sense possible. We're all survivors, all carriers of the same tested, refined genetic toolkit, all members of the same improbably successful species that clawed its way back from the edge of extinction and eventually came to dominate the planet. But it also made us all responsible, because we know what can happen. We've been to the edge before. We've seen how close we came to never existing at all. And we know that the same forces that almost destroyed us 900,000 years ago, climate change, resource scarcity, environmental catastrophe, they're still out there, still threatening, still capable of reducing us once again to a handful of survivors struggling to keep the species alive. The bottleneck is a warning, a reminder, a lesson written in our DNA about the fragility of existence and the resilience of life. We survived once. The question is whether we'll learn enough from that survival to ensure we never have to test ourselves that severely again, because next time we might not be so lucky. So here we are, at the end of an incredible journey. 900,000 years ago, humanity came within a hair's breadth of complete extinction. 99% of our ancestors died in a crisis so severe that it compressed the entire human population down to around 1,280 breeding individuals. 1,280 people. That's smaller than most high schools, smaller than many apartment buildings. For 117,000 years, longer than recorded human history, our species teetered on the absolute edge of oblivion. Every generation, the question wasn't whether humanity would thrive. It was whether humanity would survive one more year. But those 1,280 people didn't give up. They adapted, they innovated, they cooperated. They did whatever it took to keep their children alive long enough to have children of their own. Generation after generation, for over 1,000 centuries they held on. And because they held on, you're here right now, listening to this story. Think about that for a moment. Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from that tiny population of bottleneck survivors. The person sitting next to you on the bus, the barista who made your coffee this morning, every world leader, every celebrity, every stranger you pass on the street. We're all cousins, separated by only about 30,000 generations. We all carry the genetic signature of that ancient crisis, the chromosomal fusion that marks us as descendants of the survivors. Your DNA right now contains sequences that were tested and refined during those desperate millennia. The genes that help you fight off infections, they were selected for when disease swept through cramped populations. The mental flexibility that lets you learn new skills that was honed when our ancestors had to constantly adapt to changing conditions. Even your capacity for cooperation, for empathy, for working together with strangers toward common goals. That was built into our genetic architecture during the bottleneck, when small groups had to function perfectly or die. You're walking, breathing proof that resilience works, that cooperation beats competition in the long run, that intelligence and adaptability can overcome almost any challenge. The 1,280 survivors didn't have advanced technology. They didn't have agriculture or writing or any of the tools we take for granted. What they had was each other, and the absolute determination to keep going when everything looked hopeless. And that resilience didn't end when the crisis did. Those survivors went on to populate 3 continents, spawning 3 distinct human species. Their descendants mastered Ice Age Europe, high-altitude Asia, and the constantly changing environments of Africa. They developed language, art, technology, culture. They survived plague and famine and ice ages and droughts. They competed with giant predators and adapted to every environment on Earth. and eventually one branch of that family tree, modern humans, went on to achieve things their bottleneck ancestors couldn't have imagined. We've walked on the moon, we've decoded our own DNA, we've built civilizations that span continents, and communication networks that circle the globe in milliseconds. We've gone from 10,280 individuals struggling to find enough food to survive the week to 8 billion people debating what to have for dinner. But here's what really gets me about this story. We still don't know everything. Despite decades of research, despite sophisticated genetic analysis and fossil evidence and climate reconstructions, huge mysteries remain. We don't know for certain what caused the bottleneck. Was it a supervolcano, climate collapse, disease, something else entirely? We have theories, but no definitive answer. We don't know exactly where the 1,280 survivors lived. Somewhere in Africa, certainly, but where? How were they distributed? Were they all in one region, or scattered across multiple refuges? We don't know how they communicated during the crisis. Did they already have language? Or did language evolve during the bottleneck itself, selected for because groups that could communicate more effectively survived better? We don't know if they remembered their pre-bottleneck ancestors. Did they have oral traditions that preserved memories of when humanity was more numerous? Or was everything before the crisis lost to time? These mysteries remain locked in the past, waiting for future discoveries to unlock them. Every year, new genetic techniques reveal more about our ancient history. Every decade, archaeologists find new fossils that fill in pieces of the puzzle. The story isn't over. We're still discovering who we are and where we came from. And that brings us to you, right now. Watching this video, you're part of this ongoing story. The genetic legacy of those 1,280 survivors flows through your veins. The adaptability they developed lets you navigate the complexities of modern life. The cooperation skills they refined let you work with people from completely different backgrounds and cultures. The resilience they embody gives you the capacity to overcome whatever challenges you face. If this story amazed you, if learning about humanity's forgotten apocalypse and incredible recovery moved you at all, hit that like button. Let me know this deep dive into our ancient history resonated with you, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. New York, Mumbai, Lagos, Tokyo, São Paulo. It doesn't matter where you are, you're connected to everyone else watching this video by an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back nearly 1 million years to those 1,280 survivors. In a real sense, we're all family, all descendants of the greatest survivors in human history. If you want more stories like this, more deep dives into humanity's forgotten history, the incredible events that shaped who we are but don't make it into most history books, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started exploring the hidden chapters of human evolution. Here's my final thought as you drift off to sleep. You carry within you the DNA of survivors, people who faced extinction and refused to quit, people who endured 117,000 years of hardship and came out stronger, people who adapted to challenges that would have destroyed any other species. That's your inheritance. That's your legacy. Never forget it. Sleep well.